Hi, this is Lili Anderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. I appreciate your joining me. This week, the curriculum covers Exodus 7 through 13. As ever, I'm grateful for all of you who listen to the podcast and take time to do so. I'm especially grateful to all the Patreon subscribers. I have put some extra content again recently, particularly on the subject of adult children who are cutting off their parents. The first part that is already posted talks about possibly legitimate reasons that adult children distance themselves from their parents. But it's not done in the extreme manner that we're seeing trend currently. But I do want to talk about that as a foundation, that there are some reasons that it's appropriate to put some distance, not to cut off forever, not to fail to leave a door open. But anyway, I discussed that. But the second part, which is already recorded and will be posted soon, talks about this current trend that is so incredibly painful and can be very hard to understand, that does seem to indicate that there is a sort of therapeutic push for some of these adult children to banish their parents from their lives. And I discussed that in this second part, which will be posted in just a few days. So thank you for your interest in supporting the podcast, all of you subscribers. There's a link below that can take you to a subscription page if you're able to support the podcast. Again, my enduring thanks to those who allow me to continue with this project. So, a couple of news items today. One of them so absurd and ridiculous that I almost hesitate to discuss it, but it is kind of Mormons, to use our former nickname that is still used by some, but Mormons in the media, in really a horrific way in this case. This is one of the women on that series, Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. I have to look at my notes because I don't really pay attention to those things. I did comment on it when we heard that it was beginning, just how absurd these things are, that people still seem to associate themselves to either current attendance in church or previous activity just to get a buzz and just to promote themselves as these sort of anomalies. Certainly they're not representative of church members in general, I'm happy to say, but one of them, Taylor Frankie Paul, and ironically, she is one of the two. I'm going to have to look this stuff up because I really don't follow it, but she's been in the news lately, for lousy reasons, and really, her life is this huge mess and tragedy at this point. I think there are 8 of them that are part of that show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, but she's one of the 2 that basically says she's still a believer in the church and talks about, becoming active again. The other one is apparently still a primary teacher, at least according to what I saw online. So enough said about that. Okay, you got to wonder, but this Taylor Frankie Paul was recruited to be the Bachelorette. Now, again, these are shows that I've never watched. Chris and I never watched The Bachelor or whatever. I'm not saying it's, people can't watch it if you want to watch it or whatever. But anyway, those things have never appealed to us and we never watched them. And it sounds like they're degrading fast. This Bachelorette season was completely filmed featuring this woman, Taylor Paul. And then they decided not to air the season because there was a video released by her ex-live-in boyfriend, who is the father of her 3rd child. So apparently she was married to a guy who was a member of the church, and they had 2 children. And then when she was doing this Secret Lives thing, one of the episodes, she apparently revealed that she and her husband were in open marriage, meaning that they were like swingers. So they had other sexual partners. And they were supposed to just be open about it and make sure that the other partner knew, which is so ridiculous and so insane and evil. And yet she had a secret relationship with somebody that her husband didn't know about. So when he found out, things blew up and they divorced. And then she lived with this guy for a while and they had a third child, a little boy. And they were having a fight. And in the fight, she gets really violent and is throwing things at him, including like some bar stools that she picks up and heaves across at him. And he recorded it on his phone. So he released this video publicly that shows her in this violent response. And after that went public, the Bachelorette people decided not to air the season where she was the prize, which you're like, sheesh. Apparently, some of the guys that were, vying for her interest are thinking of suing the show, probably because they missed their chance at fame, but they say it's because they were put in these relationship moments with this woman who is violent and maybe they were at risk. So anyway, you really can't make this stuff up. It's beyond ridiculous. She was arrested by Harriman police. Harriman is kind of west of me. I'm in Draper, and it's kind of up against the western mountains of the Salt Lake Valley here at the south end. But somehow the Draper Police Department is also involved. I don't know the details of why, but they've made some statements that they're still investigating the situation. And then after the cancellation of this season of The Bachelorette, she was spotted in Salt Lake City where she was wearing a sweatshirt that said on the back, "Can't wait to sleep with you." So this is a woman who says she still holds to her Latter-day Saint faith. Who knows what that means to her at this point? One of her spokespeople, or maybe her spokesperson, said in an interview that she prioritizes her family's safety and security, even though in the video, the boyfriend is heard to say, "Your daughter is right here," and she was crying. So she's doing this violent stuff in front of her daughter. And that is a crime. And that is apparently what the charges are against her, because you cannot intentionally or knowingly expose your child to domestic violence. And that is a crime. So that is apparently what she has been arrested for and that they're investigating. Now, let me just mention how sometimes people who are explaining their decision to leave the church say that, living the gospel is just too hard. You look at something like this and think, oh, harder than living this life? Like, the gospel protects us from so much unnecessary drama, from so much ugliness. I don't mean that we're immune. We also have serious problems amongst us, and wherever sin is involved, and it's not just sin. It can be the troubles of life or just being on this fallen planet. But living the gospel is so much easier than the alternative in so many significant ways that I'm just reminded of that when I hear these crazy stories. Like, really? Your life is better. And, I've been asked by people before, and I understand the question because they may have friends or relatives that they're pretty close to who decide to stop living some part of the gospel or turn away from the church completely. And they'll say things like, okay, I stopped paying my tithing, or I'm not going to church anymore, and now I'm vaping or drinking, or I'm not wearing my garments anymore, or whatever, and I've never been happier. And they will make those statements quite openly and cheerfully and with a lot of confidence. I'm so much happier since I, no longer have to do this or that or the other. And of course, there's immediate pleasure. That's the deal with Satan. Like, that's what Satan has to offer, is immediate pleasure, that dopamine hit. But guess what? As has been well documented, with all behaviors of this kind that are just pleasure fulfilling, that are really in service of the natural man and just the appetites of the natural man, that high, let's say, that you get, that dopamine hit, starts out pretty high. And then it takes more and more input of, those behaviors to reach that high because you get desensitized. And then after a while, it's not giving you a high at all. And then you start to have the bill come due. And just as we saw clearly with Korihor, Satan doesn't support you forever. Like for a while, he might give you that time in the sun where you're dancing around and thinking you've got it made. And the huge deception, I'm free now of all constraints, but you really become a slave to your appetites and then to Satan. That's the snare and that's the sequence. And it always happens that way if you persist on that path. So it's tragic that people think this is happiness, to turn their backs on their covenants and stop subjecting themselves to the commandments of God. And I say that with my tongue in my cheek because that submission is what ultimately frees us to fulfill our potential, to magnify who we are and who we can be eternally, and opens up the channel of the Spirit to be with us, to come to us, to be with us, to eventually remain with us in sanctified happiness that is truly joy, that can be forever. So, pretty tragic. Now, the other story is a happier story, still pretty ironic. And, oh my gosh, there's still a lot of crazy stuff out there. I don't mean that the world is really getting better, but we are seeing some things kind of brought to a tipping point where people have to kind of decide if they're going to pay any attention to action and consequence or not, and continue in their blindness that is deliberate, as did Pharaoh. So we're going to talk about that today. And sorry, I have a little bit of a runny nose today, so forgive me for the sniffing and the Kleenex. But anyway, the chief creative officer at Pixar, the motion studio Pixar that did some really big hits a while ago, and his name is Pete Docter. I think that's his pronunciation. He was personally the director of Monsters, Inc., Up, and Inside Out, and all of those movies were quite successful. And he was interviewed recently for the magazine Variety, which is an entertainment publication, and he gave his reasoning on why the studio eventually cut the LGBTQ storyline from a movie that was released in 2025 called Elio. I didn't notice the release of this movie, but I really don't care. But these are supposed to be family-friendly movies, right? And apparently that movie started with a very strong kind of transgender storyline for the main character. In fact, they devoted a scene that was all about, and it took some time apparently, they showed little clips of it or storyboard parts of it that showed him very confused and frustrated about knowing which bathroom to go into, the men's or the women's bathroom, and how stressful that was and all this kind of stuff. And apparently there was a lot of intimation in the movie, or even like playing out, stuff that he was imagining himself raising a child with a boyfriend, and he's a boy. So anyway, saw himself as transgender, but had these same-sex love relationships. At any rate, I don't know if it was released that way and then they made some changes. It may have been that. I don't really care about the details. Some of you might know them, but it was a dud. It was maybe their biggest box office bomb ever. They spent $150 million on making this movie, and the first weekend's receipts were so low that, again, I think at that point they changed the movie. And then it didn't have much of a plot because they said the transgender thing was such a strong plot theme that when they took out some of those scenes, that people were kind of like, you can't tell what this movie is about. And it still was a bomb. And apparently a lot of people posted videos that they had taken on their phones in the theater to watch that movie. And they would like take their phone and, show around the theater that it was like basically empty. Like they're the only ones in there. And they just wanted to go to see how bad the movie was. So it really was a financial disaster for Pixar. So anyway, here's the statement that this chief creative officer makes, which is, you're kind of like, You think? Anyway, he begins to state the obvious. Quote, "We're making a movie, not hundreds of millions of dollars of therapy for mentally ill people and niche audiences that lose hundreds of millions of dollars." I mean, that's pretty plain spoken for people in this industry to say that, hey, we're supposed to be making a movie, not making therapy for mentally ill people and niche audiences. Wow. And apparently he got quite a bit of backlash from a lot of the employees, even in Pixar and other Disney organizations, because Pixar is owned by Disney, which used to be such a safe family company, right? But that's been a long time ago now. It's another tragic tale, right? I'm sure Walt Disney is spinning in his grave. He said, Disney needs its next hit franchise. I mean, they had done Toy Story, which was incredibly, incredibly successful, and Monsters, Inc., things like that, that had become popular and did very well. But he says, we need another hit franchise like that. Can Pixar's reluctant leader deliver? The headline says. The Toy Story studio used to print money for Disney, but hasn't, this is from the Variety article, but hasn't made an original blockbuster in nearly a decade. You've heard that expression, haven't you? Go woke and go broke. Apparently, this is one of the current examples. Its top creative executive admits he's made mistakes. Apparently, they have hired in-house a ton of people who identify in that LGBT alphabet community. And so, again, they pushed back a lot when he made this statement, but they don't have a lot of power. And he's just saying, look, we've got a bottom line to consider. You realize, don't you, that like these big companies have, of course, lots of shareholders. And the shareholders have a right to hold the people directing the company's business accountable for losses in stock value. So there's a very clear financial lever here because they can bring suits against, the board of directors or whomever is in charge of the decisions that are losing money for the shares. And the stock prices have really dipped on a lot of these companies as they have, done all this stuff that people don't like, or at least most people don't like. Later in the article, it says, after a series of disappointments culminating in last year's bomb, Elio, Doctor is pushing Pixar to re-embrace the universally relatable concepts like talking toys and monsters in the closet that once made it a juggernaut. As time's gone on, Doctor said, I realized my job is to make sure the films appeal to everybody. Oh, there's a novel thought. Like, you're in the entertainment industry. You think you should entertain? Anyway, he's been with the company 6 years, and that was noted. As he goes on, I probably over-indexed on letting directors do whatever they wanted, effectively trading the studio's golden era formula for a self-indulgent vibe check that nobody asked for. Anyway, I found this to be delightful. After recent flops, the digital consensus is clear. Pixar has lost the plot. You may remember that Disney was in the news in a similar way in March of 2022. So the state of Florida had passed something called Florida's Parental Rights in Education Act. Now, it was billed by opposition spokespeople as the Don't Say Gay bill. But listen to what that act required. We have gone so extreme, brothers and sisters, you know that, right? It was a bill banning classroom instruction on sexual orientation or sexual identity from kindergarten through third grade. K through 3. Like, we're not even talking fourth graders or fifth graders that were protected. But the bill did act to protect this indoctrination from happening at least prior to fourth grade. Like, again, it wasn't nearly enough, but it was an effort to protect our very young students from being exposed to sexual indoctrination. And that was pushed back against strongly by the Alphabet Coalition. And as I said, it was called the Don't Say Gay bill. So they really tried to hype that up as if it was this really homophobic agenda. And then during that time, somebody caught on video or released something that had been taped in a meeting or whatever of a Disney executive who said, I'm thrilled to be a part of Disney. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but she did say the words that we have been pushing this not so secret gay agenda. So she fully acknowledged that it wasn't even subtle. And she talked about having gay characters embrace in the back or kiss in the background of some things that they were throwing those things in gratuitously just to try to promote this gay agenda. And she said, I don't have to be afraid of doing that. And then she went on and said, wherever I could, I was just basically adding queerness. And again, these movies and products were targeted towards family, but particularly supposed to be friendly for children. So the parents didn't have to worry. And they were deliberately imposing these agendas in there and not even ashamed to articulate that. So this has been going on for a long time. Again, Elia was the worst box office opening ever for Pixar. Pixar staffers apparently broke down over cutting the trans storyline. Someone was reported to say, I can't tell you how much I cried. So this is good news that even if it's just a financial consideration, that some people are being rational enough to say, like, we should stop pushing this agenda. And it is pretty bold that the guy said, we're not spending these hundreds of millions of dollars to do therapy for the mentally ill. Anyway, I was certainly not concerned about sensitivity. And yet, I'm not going to disagree kind of with the conclusion there. Although, I have sympathy for the mentally ill, of course, and certainly people who struggle with sexual identity. But this is not the answer to think that this can be imposed on children and the general population, but they're still supposed to pay lots of money for your product. So anyway, I guess that's kind of good news. Now we're going to talk now. Let's jump to Exodus and talk about these next chapters. I'm going to very lightly touch on the chapters. Let's just kind of look through it a few things because this story, again, is super familiar. We know about the plagues that were visited on the people of Egypt so that Pharaoh would finally let the people go. And as we know, he still took back that promise, and we're going to have another miracle next time. But this time, we see themes, of course, beyond the plagues. And I really want to point this out. We're going to talk about this as a wrap today about the character of the children of Israel to a large extent after these 400 years plus of bondage in Egypt. And there's some really good takeaways from that. But let's just kind of look through every time, as I mentioned last time, that it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. There's a correction that Joseph Smith made in his translation of the Old Testament where he corrects that to Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And we've talked about that before, but I hope that you noted that. Also, of course, he makes it clear that he's going to multiply his signs. This is right here in chapter 7, verse 3. And he's going to show his wonders in the land of Egypt. Verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. So that is the intent of all of this. But it's not just that. It's also to work upon these enslaved children of Israel. As we see, they're a hardened case, and those are some natural products of being in bondage. But again, let's save that for now. It, of course, specifies each of the plagues, and Pharaoh keeps saying, oh yeah, okay, fine, I am done with this. And then he recants. Now, there is an interesting note here, and I actually looked this up, and it's considered to be the case that the children of Israel were subjected to the first 3 plagues, which are the blood of the water, so that there's no clear water in Egypt, and then the frogs everywhere, and then the lice. So it doesn't distinguish the children of Israel as being separate or protected from those, at least as far as the record goes, and most Bible scholars agree. But then when Moses is saying that the next plague is going to be flies, swarms of flies that will plague Egypt, in verse 22 of chapter 8, I will sever in that day the land of Goshen. And the land of Goshen, of course, is where the Israelites live. in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. And then in verse 23, I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. So it sounds like at this point, the children of Israel were protected from the plagues that follow. However, we know that they could have been subject to the loss of their firstborn had it not been for the instructions given through the Lord or through Moses from the Lord to protect the house of Israel with the passing over of the angel of death that then brings about the feast of the Passover that is still celebrated to this day by the Jews. And many of us have had our own participation with Passover Seders so that we can experience that meaning as well. And really, if we understand it correctly, it has really powerful gospel meaning to the symbolism of the Passover Seder, which again we'll talk about in a little bit. So anyway, the other plagues continue. There is some discussion between Pharaoh and Moses about, well, who do you want to go to do these sacrifices to your God in the wilderness? Because at first Moses says, we're just going to go and offer sacrifice to our God. And maybe that's to just introduce the idea of the children of Israel leaving, but he's not going to say we're never coming back at first, apparently. But Pharaoh, who of course may suspect that like this is their exit strategy, is saying, well, at one point, who's going with you? This is in chapter 10, where he's tired of the locusts at this point. I saw a video once. This was one of those nature documentaries, and Chris and I were watching this documentary on locusts. And this was in Africa, and it showed these swarms of locusts that really do look like storm clouds that come in on the horizon and travel in the sky, and they're dark and thick. And it showed them going to a tree that was fully leafed out, really beautiful, large tree. And the locusts settle in the tree, and I don't remember how long it was, but it was not that long. And the locusts finally leave, and the leaves are completely gone from this tree. I mean, they're absolutely decimated. They're gone. They're eaten. So it was stunning to see a visual of that. Probably find it on YouTube if you want to show your kids. But at any rate, that's the most recent plague. And Pharaoh says, who are they that shall go? Like, who are you planning to take? And Moses says, all of us, our young and our old, our sons, daughters, our flocks, our herds, we're all going to go. And Pharaoh says in verse 11, no, not so. Go now, ye that are men. So he's saying, okay, well, I'll let you go with just your men, but you have to leave everything else behind. And Moses says no. So then there's hail and whatever else, and whatever is left by the locusts is destroyed by the hail. And it's hail with like fire in it. So it actually says some areas boil, which must have been quite the sight to see. Then there's darkness, but the children of Israel have light in their dwellings. It's toward the end of chapter 10. And then chapter 11, Moses tells them that, this is verse 2, let every man borrow of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor jewels of silver, jewels of gold. In other words, go to these people that you've been living around and tell them they need to give you their riches. So this is why it says that, they spoiled Egypt, meaning that they left with the spoils of war in a way, even though they hadn't been engaged in a physical war or battle. But they took the riches of Egypt with them. And the Egyptians are getting sick of this, as you might imagine. It's interesting that there is some comment here that the servants of Pharaoh actually are believing that the Lord can do what he's going to do, and they're trying to be cautious. This is back in chapter 9, verse 20. He that feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his cattle flee into the houses. That was when the cattle were afflicted with that plague. And they said, okay, well, we hear that's coming and we're going to protect ourselves. Pharaoh wouldn't do that. He was stubborn and proud, but the servants, some of them were like really starting to believe what Moses was saying and to recognize the power of the God of Israel. But Pharaoh continues to be so stubborn that eventually, of course, there is the plague of the loss of the firstborn, and the firstborn of every household, every family, as well as of the herds. are going to be killed that night. And the Lord institutes then this feast of the Passover, except at first it's this probably kind of scary night where Moses says the angel of death is going to come by, and we are going to have each of you take the blood of a lamb and strike it on the 2 side posts and on the upper doorpost. So the side post and the lintel of each entry to their dwellings. And that is a mark that they are of the house of Israel. Of course, this is signifying the power of the Lamb of God. And again, we'll talk more about the symbolism in a moment. And then he instructs them on what they shall eat that night, and that it needs to be unleavened bread and bitter herbs and a lamb roasted with fire, and this will be a memorial throughout the generations. And if you don't observe that, then you'll be cut off from Israel, and gives a lot of specifics about the Passover and how it's to be observed. And then, frankly, it must have been just this horrific cry of anguish that comes from Egypt in verse 30 of chapter 12. Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. And he calls to Moses and Aaron and says, "Get out." And the Egyptians, in verse 33, were urgent that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We be all dead men." Like, none of us will be spared if we don't get them out of here soon. And then again in verse 35, they borrowed of the Egyptians, borrowed, quote unquote, because they're not going to bring back the jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And in verse 36 at the end, they spoiled the Egyptians, again, meaning they took the spoils of Egypt as if they were a conquering army. That's what conquering armies do. They go in and they take the riches, right? And the children of Israel journey out of the city of Ramses, where they were building those monuments, and they leave with all their people and all their herds. And they were there for 430 years, it says in verse 40. And remember, this is in chapter 13, that Moses talks about the firstborn of beasts and to men to be sanctified unto the Lord. And they do the feast of the unleavened bread, and they take the bones of Joseph. That's mentioned in verse 19 of chapter 13. And then it also mentions that there will be a pillar of a cloud during the day, and by night a pillar of fire. So these are huge manifestations of God's presence with the house of Israel. And I want to go back to verse 17 of chapter 13, that Pharaoh, lets them go finally, but God tells Moses to make sure they don't go through the land of the Philistines, even though that is the most direct path. Well, that was near, so sort of, a straight line between 2 points on their escape route. But he says, no, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, meaning that the Philistines, who tended to be enemies, if they make aggressive actions toward the people of Israel, the children of Israel, then the children might be afraid. And when it says repent, meaning that they will be sorry they left Egypt and return to Egypt. So the Lord knows who he's dealing with here and how weak they are. So let's talk about this. Of course, we have all these manifestations of God's great power. We've been talking a little bit about how important it is to recognize the omnipotence of God and to not be afraid or condemning at its use in appropriate and righteous judgment or for necessary purposes. That is the whole principle of meekness, that power is restrained until it is necessary to use it in the service of God and his plan or of the covenant as directed by the Spirit and the Lord. So anyway, this is one of those places where power is on display in this incredible way. And it's not over. We're going to see another great sign in the next lesson, and certainly others to come. But rather than sit back and try to armchair quarterback this and say, he should have or he should not have, or it was harsh or it was too severe, we want to keep reminding ourselves that God's ways are not our ways. And the sooner we start to lift ourselves to his thinking, his ways, the better. the whole idea is to start to think like God. I've quoted this before, but I've always loved this since I found it when I was in seminary for some kind of project in one of the classes to find some inspiring quotes. And one that I found that I've always loved was David O. McKay, who said that, in his opinion, spirituality was the result of a long-term acquaintance with godlike thoughts. So as I've continued to study and learn about the gospel and about the way God thinks, and that his ways are higher, I've thought that is really implied there too, or stated in David O. McKay's quote, that this is a way to build our spirituality, our connectedness with God, our receptivity to the sanctifying power of the Holy Ghost, to learn to think the way God thinks. So when we are puzzled or confused or even distressed by the ways of God, I hope that we will pause and say, let me seek the Spirit, let me be prayerful and thoughtful and study this out and use good critical thinking, but critical thinking that is grounded and surrounded by faith, that God's ways are higher than our ways, that his thoughts are higher, and that process can help us to become more like him, not to reject him or get left in our place of distress or dissonance with God's ways. That would be a tragedy. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it did occur to me as I was rereading these chapters, gosh, how hard are our hearts in some areas? And I wonder, that maybe we all have areas of our lives where our hearts are harder, maybe because of injury or insecurities or fears or sensitivities of some kind. And we react strongly against some of the ways of the Lord or the doctrines that are not as immediately soothing, although I believe all doctrine does free us ultimately from fear and troubles. But the journey, from discomfort to comfort with those things can take a while on some occasions. So I just wanted to have us think about, what does it take to soften my heart? Or do I persist in some stubbornness in some areas that are less comfortable or less easily understood? And we can always take that to the Lord and ask for his help in softening our hearts if we are willing to be humble in trusting that his ways are better than ours. I have always been kind of pained about this verse in Isaiah. I mean, I love it, and I think it's incredibly profound, but it's also tragic. This is Isaiah 6, verse 10. And it's an ironic statement. Obviously, this is not really what we mean. It's the irony that is being pointed out here. Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes. This is making their hearts hard and their minds closed, right? Lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and convert and be healed. So it's an ironic warning that sometimes it seems that we want our hearts, it says, to be fat, but anyway, not soft in the right way, and to make our ears heavy and our eyes shut, lest, for heaven's sake, right? Lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and convert and be saved. Like, heaven forbid that they should actually listen and receive and be saved. May we certainly listen, see, listen, feel with our hearts, convert and be saved. And the beautiful word here, be healed. Now let's talk about the Passover a little bit. Sometimes this is the celebration of the Jews, the feast of the Jews, that is called the holiday of questions. There are 4 traditional questions that are supposed to be asked by the youngest child present at the Passover Seder. And an adult can do it if there's no child present. But the questions are these. First of all, the kind of the overarching question, why is this night different from all other nights? And then here are the 4 specific questions. Number 1, why is it that on all other nights we eat both leavened bread and matzah, but on this night we eat only matzah? Second question, why is it that on all other nights we eat any kind of vegetable, but on this night we eat only bitter herbs. Number 3, why is it that on all other nights we do not dip our vegetables even once, but on this night we dip them twice? First in salt water and then in charoset. And 4, why is it that on all other nights we eat either sitting or reclining, but on this night we all recline? So the answers are that the reason that they only eat matzah on this night is that it represents the bread of affliction, because they didn't have time to let the bread rise. That takes time. So they are leaving Egypt in haste. Once Pharaoh finally gets sick of them and the Egyptians all cry out, let them leave or we're all dead men, they have to hurry. And so they don't have time to let the bread rise. So it represents the bread of affliction of their bondage and the haste of leaving Egypt. Symbolically, it represents purity, as leaven or yeast is viewed as a symbol of corruption and sin. The bitter herbs are a symbol of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt and the bitter emotional spiritual effects of sin, which prevents us from returning to God's presence. The Paschal lamb, which is of course part of the Passover Seder feast, and from which the blood came to put on the doorposts and the lintel to symbolize to the angel of death to pass over their homes, is to symbolize Christ's atonement. Of course, the Lamb of God that was slain or was coming to be slain. And it symbolizes his atonement, which allows spiritual death to pass over his believers, just as physical death passed over the Israelites in Egypt. And why are they reclining while they eat? Although, I've been to seders that were done by Jews, and we don't recline. Some of them were in huge banquet halls, and everybody was sitting at a table. But symbolically, and if they're in their homes, reclining is one of the symbols. And eating while reclining signifies freedom and royalty, indicating that the redeemed are no longer slaves to sin, but are free in Christ. So really some beautiful symbols to the Passover as it is given by the Lord to remind us. And of course, it's wonderful to have things to help us remember. Of course, bread has a very powerful symbolic meaning to the people of God, and this is one of the reasons, this unleavened bread. And there is a specific feast of unleavened bread that is attached to but separate from the Passover. And of course, we're about to embark on 40 years in the wilderness with the children of Israel, in which they eat manna, which is a bread-like substance that is going to nourish them. And all of that is going to become powerfully symbolic in Christ's teachings during his ministry to the Jews. And it is also symbolic of the body of Christ. And when we partake of the sacrament, hopefully all of these powerful meanings and manifestations of the symbols in bread, whether leavened or not, are brought to our remembrance and helping us to worship more deeply. So I wanted to talk again here at the end about the children of Israel and what happens to people who are in bondage for a long time, whose freedoms are taken away. I've talked a little bit about this before, but I actually made more of an outline about this. So there's several points that I want you to think about, not just for the children of Israel, but to any people who have been in some kind of limited freedom or bondage in the history of the world. Now, I'm not going to go back to the beginnings of ancient history or so on, but I am, other than the children of Israel, who are a prime example. But others that come to mind very quickly for me are, of course, those who lived in the USSR, that communist government after World War II. I'm not saying they were having a great time under the czars, but things got a lot worse under the communists when it came to the end of freedom of religion and all other kinds of freedom, as everything was run by the state and owned by the state and so on. Also, the Jews during the Holocaust. Now, that was a more spread out, it was pretty acute and very severe, that concentration camp period especially. Of course, there were times in the ghettos prior to that, where they were restricted and they could only live in certain areas in different countries in Europe and Eastern Europe, and they were quite restricted there, couldn't own property, things like that. But it wasn't as intense as when the Nazis came in and actually rounded them up and imprisoned them. And although that was, kind of brief, if you want to say it, I mean, it wasn't 430 years that the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt, but it was so acute and intense that there were a lot of similar kinds of outcomes. And then the other one that I have thought of often is those living under Franco's rule in Spain. Francisco Franco was a dictator in Spain for many years after their civil war, and he was incredibly authoritarian and dictatorial. And I mean, that was during the time when I was in Spain for 6 months with BYU and a group of students in Madrid, and that was during Franco's regime. And they had those soldiers with the tricorner hats everywhere, the Guardia Civil, except in Spain you say Guardia Civil, and they were everywhere. And there were a lot of restrictions. Now, it didn't mean we couldn't travel there and have a terrific time, because we did, but it made me kind of tie into sort of the history of Spain, and I got better acquainted with it, and sort of kept my ear to the ground about Spain as time passed, and the death of Franco came eventually, and some real changes that happened there as well. So anyway, all those are examples, and you may have others that you're very familiar with in your historical studies or family histories even, but here are some of the things that happen. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, but I have 7 issues here that do seem to be pretty consistent when people lose freedoms, even at partial levels, like in Spain. Number 1, fear becomes normal, which leads to people not speaking honestly, because you could be imprisoned or killed for saying things that are contrary to the word of the dictators. People stop trusting public institutions and become cautious even in private. Number 2, agency shrinks. Now, I've said this before and I stand by it. Nobody can take away our agency. This is a God-given gift. So we do retain agency, but it doesn't mean it can't be inhibited. And the lack of governmental freedoms or civic freedoms can shrink our agency because we don't have a lot of choices, so we get bad at making choices. If many choices are taken away from us, we don't continue to practice that in good ways. It can really weaken our confidence in our own decision making. It often weakens initiative. That certainly happened in USSR and other places. And it takes away the expectation that one's actions really matter, because if I can't really make choices about my own future or destiny, then it does seem to inhibit in a very significant way our agency. Number 3, family life becomes really strained. Some may become more tightly loyal. Now, this is always the case, right? Like when people say things like that which doesn't, this is quoting Nietzsche apparently, but that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I always want to throw in a caveat, because that's not always true. Believe you me. And I'm sure if you think about it, you've seen it too, that sometimes that which doesn't kill us almost destroys us in every other way or other significant ways. Not everybody does better after hardship. It's a choice. We can either become more bitter, or we can just decide to endure, in which case we might survive, but we don't really grow. And the other choice, of course, is the good one, where we can turn to God, put our pain and heartache on the altar, and let Him make of us what He will, so that we can grow and become closer to Him. So those are all options. So again, with a lot of these, we see that in this case, family life might become stronger because people might cling together. But in many cases, stress, suspicion, and scarcity can damage family relationships. And of course, there's always that idea in some authoritarian regimes. Maoist communist China, of course, is another big example, and it continues to a large extent today, although not nearly as intensely as after the revolution and the takeover by Mao. But in some of those countries, of course, people have been taught to inform on their parents. We saw that happen in the USSR and in communist China and in the Nazi regime. So it really can destroy family relationships, as your loyalty is supposed to be to the state or to the government over even your own family. Number 4, truth becomes dangerous. People may start saying one thing publicly and another privately. Now, I hope you're keeping in mind the children of Israel. And we're going to tie this in better here in a moment. Number 6, moral injury develops, meaning that people can be forced to participate in behaviors they know are wrong, betraying their neighbors or family, remaining silent about evil, flattering people in positions of power. And this can erode personal senses of right and wrong. Their personal conscience or the light of Christ can be damaged because to survive, they're compromising their principles right and left. Number 7, culture can weaken. Like, again, the state is trying to destroy previous culture. Religion is an enemy, the family is an enemy, because those divide loyalty or take loyalty away or threaten the loyalty that the state wants for itself. But on the other side, again, culture can deepen. And we did hear stories, and we've heard them still from communist China, but in the USSR, there were stories after the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR kind of collapsed, that there were people who had clung to their Christian faith and had privately read the Bible and prayed and even had meetings with other believers, and they strengthened their testimonies and their beliefs while others felt it weaken. So again, think about that. Now, again, it's important to recognize this because we're going to see these children of Israel be so weak and so quick to criticize Moses and to be ready at the drop of a hat to abandon God and abandon his plan for them, which is generous. We didn't read this verse, but Moses tells them, I think in that final chapter 13, that God is going to lead you to a land with milk and honey. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's going to be a great blessing. And that's not enough to stop them from turning around several times and say, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? So they're weak. And that happens in bondage for all the reasons that I've mentioned and others. We could put it this way: the oppression or bondage trains people to survive, but these very survival habits later can interfere with freedom when they are released from bondage. And that's what we're going to talk about here, that after people come out of bondage, there continue to be problems. Again, this is really going to explain these next several lessons that talk about the children of Israel and their weaknesses. So often that release from bondage can be followed by what we call disinhibition, meaning it's like a lack of restraint. Like they have been so controlled by governmental forces or the oppressor's forces that, again, they've stopped learning how to regulate themselves. So the natural man can just go wild once they're free from that very distinct oppression. And this was true. We don't have details about this with the children of Israel, but you know what? As I read about these things, I'm like, yeah, it was probably happening there too. But we see the rise of black markets, corruption, and certainly a moral whiplash where, like, again, we were so restrained that we didn't even have to have self-control because we were controlled from outside. And so once that's released, we have no self-control. And so that's the disinhibition that happens. No inhibitions at all, right? So oppression deforms a society, again, in the ways that we've mentioned. Liberation removes the oppressive lid, but does not instantly heal the deformation. So they're still deformed. They're just no longer oppressed. So it takes growth to overcome. Again, some people may have become stronger, clinging tighter to God, to their values, to their culture, to their families, but that is more the exception than the rule. So some of the things that happen is that, again, I've got 5 things here. Criminal networks expand. We saw this in the USSR, or the collapse of the USSR, and then we had more information anyway, but when it became Russia, which is still a pretty repressive society, but nothing like the old Soviet regime, the institutions were weakened once the oppressive government stepped back into slightly less oppressive stuff. Law enforcement had been compromised, so people had learned to survive through unofficial, often criminal channels. And there was a huge surge of organized crime and the Russian mafia. They just exploded seemingly overnight. Now, they had started during the oppressive years because that was the only way to get some things was through those criminal pathways, but then they really exploded once the lid was off the pot. I mentioned before that our daughter Edenit served her mission in Zimbabwe, which was under the very oppressive rule of Robert Mugabe at the time. Because of his really terrible decisions, there were often empty shelves all through the grocery stores. So when they would go to buy food, they just didn't have much to buy. And some of the elders had developed black market contacts that could get them food. And bless their hearts, they would go to the sister missionaries, including Eden, and say, hey, we're going to meet with this black market contact. Give us a list of groceries that you need or items that you need, and we'll try to get them. So again, to survive, often they would use these criminal networks, and they did survive. But then once the oppression is lifted, those organizations are in place and they tend to really expand. Also in Spain, the growth of the mafia after Franco was explosive. Number two, there's a swing from enforced restraint, again, this external bondage and lack of freedom. And once it's gone, the swing is to excess. So people push boundaries. Behaviors that were forbidden become very popular and fashionable because it's seen as a statement. But again, it's kind of this overcorrection that goes from over restraint to no restraint or disinhibition. Number three, these underground survival systems, and this is kind of an overlap with number one, like the black market, bribery, trading favors, it becomes normalized corruption, and that just becomes the default setting. Number four, cynicism can replace sincere morality and religious belief. People just look at things with much more irony because they're like, yeah, well, none of that really helped at this time if they didn't let it make them stronger under duress. And they can become opportunistic, meaning like, hey, if I have a chance to do it, I'm going to do it without worrying about moral consequences or implications, and even nihilistic, meaning that, the belief in nothingness, like nothing matters, there is no God, there is nothing meaningful in the universe. So the order of everything is forbidden becomes everything is for sale. Like again, this swing is very extreme from one side to the other extreme. Number five, again, there can be a rejection of any restraint. I know some of these are overlapping, but there are legitimate restraints in a society. There should be the norms that protect society from, chaos and craziness. And that can all be rejected because it was too oppressive. So now it's like principles of morality and religion and family norms, modesty and all, sexual restraint are all out the window. And so we do see a lot of sexual deregulation, and that did happen in the USSR. It also happened in Spain. Pornography exploded, prostitution exploded, sex becomes a commodity, and there is, again, an expansion of permissiveness. Also, a real confusion about the difference between liberty and license, meaning like, yes, freedom is important for us to be able to exercise and become good at exercising our agency, but complete license to do whatever you want is problematic, and those two are often confused after people have been oppressed for so long. So if we can keep this in mind as we see the episode of the Golden Calf, it makes more sense, because sometimes people think like, well, how is it that these people who had just had all these mighty miracles done before them in Egypt, and then even next week as we talk about the Red Sea, how can they be building a calf in the wilderness? Well, it's because they were freed from bondage, but they were not recovered from all the consequences of bondage. If they had not chosen, some did, like we have some characters like Joshua and others that are going to come to be the judges in Israel, the next generation that comes. But remember, we're going to see that first generation die off in the wilderness because God realizes they're not ready for freedom. So I can't take them to this land of milk and honey. And even the ones that do cross over have lots of weaknesses because they're just the next generation. Maybe you've read things about the children of Holocaust survivors. Those things are really interesting too, because there is sort of an intergenerational impact. It doesn't just end with the first generation, although that usually is the most affected generation. So people don't just need freedom. This is like a really important conclusion. People don't just need freedom. They need to learn to be free. And that's us, right? It's the children of Israel. It's all these people in these places that have been so oppressed. We don't just need freedom. We need to learn to be a free people in righteousness, not just to resist and reject oppression, but to govern our desires, to harness the natural man. We talk about that all the time. Now, again, I hope that all of this helps us feel increased gratitude for places that we live that are relatively free. Now, that is always fragile. It's not guaranteed ever. And we see all kinds of attacks on freedom. And we know that this country, the United States of America, has never been perfect about handling freedom. Everybody has flaws. This country has had serious flaws. Certainly, as I mentioned before, Joseph Smith had real complaints about the way the government was failing to follow up on defending freedom of religion and the protection of its citizens. So we haven't ever been perfect in this country or any country, but there are societies in this world that are much more free than others, and where at least there can be complaint or we can seek redress, or at least we've been able to in the past. Of course, the system gets corrupted and then, accountability goes and all that kind of stuff that we're seeing a lot of now. But can you see why it was essential that the gospel be restored in the United States of America? And to tie this into our day, how incredibly inspired are our living prophets. President Dallin Oaks and his counselors, who as a first presidency have invited the whole world to participate in a worldwide fast on July 5th of this year, the day after the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence for the United States of America, the beginning of this free country that was directed, the revolution being directed by God miraculously, and the Constitution being incredibly inspired. And of course, the Declaration of Independence, an incredibly inspired and beautiful document as well, that has inspired people all around the world to seek freedom and to try to also copy that idea in some of their constitutions and so on. There's no other country where Joseph Smith would have made it to age 38. I've said that many times. The church as it was had to flee the organized United States and go out into uncharted territory, almost uncharted territory that nobody wanted because it was this barren wasteland and the Lord could make it bloom, but that's where they had to go to survive. So it was touch and go even here, but nowhere else could it even have happened the way it happened here. And I'm so grateful that our First Presidency is inviting us to contemplate that more deeply. And I think it's very relevant at this time that we're studying again the history of the ancient house of Israel and this incredible event that happened that brought them out of bondage. And to realize that freedom alone doesn't make us free. We have to learn to be free. Some of them just would not learn that, many of them. And even the next generations struggled. But we can be appreciative of the freedoms we have wherever we are in the world that may allow us some freedoms. And if we are not in a place of freedom, may we pray for increased freedom. And of course, when the Lord comes, evil will be eliminated and we will be free of that influence for 1,000 years. That day will come quickly. I'm grateful for these scriptures. I'm grateful for what it teaches us about them and about us. May we teach these things to our children and our grandchildren where we're able to do that without contention, and invite them to be grateful for whatever level of liberty they are enjoying, and to be grateful for the inspired men who wrote amazing documents that have allowed for religious freedom to an extent, at least, that is significant in this country, although largely imperfect. And in that worldwide fast, that will be one of the things to focus on, to pray for religious liberty around the world as we go through this challenging time prior to the second coming. It's prophesied, it's real, it's painful, but it is sure that the Lord will be with us if we will be with him. We can choose celestial glory, and we can build Zion even now in our own lives and invite our families to join in. The day will come when Zion will be tangible and concrete. May we be ready for that day. As ever, my loving thanks to my husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson at Point Digital. Take care.